I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
And we are VIMTV Velocities in Music, the best kept secret in music reviews. Tom and I have a favorite band, or at least one of our shared favorite bands. Arcade Fire. In 2004, they came out with their first album, Funeral. I was in high school at the time. It was my senior year of high school. Tom, you were a couple grades below me.
Yes.
And I remember going to the store and buying Funeral and thinking, wow, this is a really cool album cover. I've heard, some good things about this band. There was a light buzz around them at the time. They hadn't really gotten super famous yet.
No, it took a while. It was kind of a slow grower for a lot of people.
So I remember in October 2004 listening to Funeral and just absolutely hating it. And eventually I put it down and said, I can't do this. I just don't like the sound. I don't like it at all. And then a couple years later, it was like late 2005, 2006, I picked up Funeral again, listened to it, and it blew my mind. From that moment forward, Arcade Fire has been just an absolutely monumental band in my musical library that I've carried with me in my pocket over the years. They're the quintessential indie rock band and have been known to be the upper echelon of indie rock for the past several years. Tom, what do you think about this band's history? Can you give us a recap of where they come from since 2004?
Yeah, well, they put out several albums since then. It's been a pretty even 3 years between albums. And it's funny because, you said they are the kind of the quintessential indie rock band right now. And I think a lot about what that has to do with is that, first off, stylistically, what they do really represents what indie rock is all about. They're very emotional. They're all about that emotional connection with their listeners. And it's one of those things where if you don't feel that with the music, you're probably not going to get into it that much. And as you said, you had a little bit of trouble getting into Funeral. I was the same way. I remember listening to it when it came out, and I was like, I could tell this is pretty cool, but I just don't really care. And it took a little while for me to really dig into the emotional depth of the songs, and once I was able to make that connection, it's been one of the most important albums in my life to me, and it's one of my all-time favorites.
Right.
So I was very excited to see where they went from there. In 2007, they came out with Neon Bible, which still they're going for that kind of emotional impact, but rather than be on a completely personal level, that's more about the subject matter. They talk about a lot of social issues, things dealing with religion and the way that impacts people. So from there, it's not really going straight towards your heart. It's kind of approaching your mind and your intellect first, and then seeing if the topics that they're addressing really connect with you.
And Neon Bible's headiness was, it's not like Funeral didn't have that headiness. There was a lot of intellectual value within the music, but you're right, it was all about the emotional connection. You could not fall in love with any Arcade Fire album without that intense emotional connection. Now, Neon Bible, definitely from especially a lyrical perspective, Win Butler, the frontman for Arcade Fire, he is known to be just an exemplary lyricist. And throughout all of the Arcade Fire's albums has had just really stimulating lyrics. In Neon Bible, he went off the deep end a bit, I'd say, and really went into some deep subject matters and tried to evoke a lot of emotion through lyrics. It was an interesting take. Neon Bible, while that's not my favorite Arcade Fire album, it was definitely one that, there were certain tracks off of it that I really love. It didn't have that album consistency that Funeral had. But as, they moved on, we had another 3-year break, and then in 2010 they came out with the Suburbs, which we reviewed right when it came out.
And the Suburbs was actually an album that I had a lot of trouble with at first. I didn't really get into it, and then I ended up loving it. And I think that the reason, at least for me, that Funeral and the Suburbs are a little bit more successful than Neon Bible is because of the way they approach that emotional connection, we've been saying a lot, and doing that through the lyrics. Because you look at Funeral, and the idea behind that album was that the front man and his wife Regine, also in the band, kind of the front woman, they were going through kind of a lot of family trauma. They had a lot of family members die, and it was very much inspired by those events and those people and those relationships. Then Neon Bible, it's more like they tackled kind of external topics, things like religion and family issues and things like that they just, maybe they are very connected to, but you didn't get the feeling that they were in the music. And then the Suburbs was more about Win Butler's upbringing, growing up in the suburbs, those experiences. And I think that's just something that people can connect with a little bit more. It's a little bit more universal, and because of that, it's just a little easier to click with. So it really depends on how they're approaching those topics and whether or not you can directly relate to them or not. Because, maybe you can connect to those external internal ideas on an intellectual level, but it's really about when it hits your emotional core that these albums are the most effective.
And The Suburbs was this grand album. It was much larger than Funeral or Neon Bible. It tackled bigger subject matters, as Tom, you mentioned, you know, was kind of reflecting on their youth and like where they grew up and things like that. But it also tackled their youth from a musical perspective, too. It had a lot of styles that referenced the Boss and a lot of the music they were listening to when they were younger. It was a lot of societal commentary as well within the lyrics. So it was really the album, the Arcade Fire album of all albums. It tackled everything that made up the band and became really a symbol for what the band stood for and what indie rock stood for in the year 2010.
And then it won Album of the Year.
It won a Grammy. It won a Grammy. Actually, in a surprise fashion. No one expected the Arcade Fire to win the Grammy for Best Album, and they did it with The Suburbs. Now, the interesting thing about that is the bar is set up here. And so we know that, you know, a lot of new-coming fans who weren't on board for Funeral or Neon Bible or maybe even The Suburbs until they watched the Grammys and saw that Arcade Fire won, and, you know, who's this indie rock band? All of a sudden, you know, Arcade Fire has this massive rush of attention. And expectations go along with that. The band is at the height of their commercial success. There's all these musical expectations, but also, I think, you know, monetary expectations as well. So, whether or not that plays into their fourth album, Reflektor, which just came out, which obviously we're reviewing for you today, whether or not this plays into how they constructed the album, I think that that's something that when you're listening to it, you definitely have to have a keen sense of Arcade Fire's history, where they come from, because that is how you can really, it can really be kind of a door to understanding how they wrote Reflektor.
And it's how you determine where they're going, is by knowing where they've been. So coming into Reflektor, just to start with, the lead single from the album, the first track, was released as a single. And
earlier in 2013.
Yeah, and it got a lot of people talking because this was notably a different sound. First off, it's a 7.5-minute track, which is the second to longest track on the album, not counting the last track. It is the longest track. And it incorporated a lot of different sounds and musical elements than what we've heard them do in the past. A lot of people were throwing out the word dancey, which
disco,
is electronic, which is kind of fair, just because it's got kind of a bouncy beat, and more than anything, it's about the bass line. Now let's go out there and say this is a band that has done beats like that and grooves like that in the past. I mean, you listen to Sprawl 2 off The Suburbs, that's a very dancey track.
That was one of my favorite tracks, and they just made it work. It had that emotional connection, it was fun, and I did dance to it.
Exactly, you can. I played it at some weddings that I DJ'd, you know? So there was an idea of that there, but it really depended on where they were going to take the rest of the album. Was the whole album going to sound like that? Was it just this kind of one-off track? So I was very eager to see where they were going to take that, especially considering this is a double album.
Double album. 75 minutes long, which, Tom, you've noted, this is, you know, there's been a lot of other 73, 75-minute albums that aren't technically double albums.
No, they're not. So that's something that's a conscious decision, and anytime an artist does that, I think it's really interesting because you have to think about the reason why they're choosing to make it a double album. Look at some of the albums we've reviewed in the past. M83, Hurry Up, We're Dreaming, Baroness, Yellow and Green. Both of those are double albums that actually could fit on one disc. Now, whether an album's a double album or not usually depends on the medium in which it's being released. There are a lot of albums that were released way back in the 60s that were double albums at the time that can fit on one CD. I'm thinking albums like Captain Beefheart's Trout Mask Replica, things like that. It had to be released as a double album, but now in the age of digital media and CDs, if it can fit on an 80-minute CD, generally then you have the choice to make it that way or not. I'm thinking albums like Tool's Lateralis or Red Hot Chili Peppers' Blood Sugar Sex Magic, both well over the 70-minute mark, both widely considered to be single discs, not double albums. So there is a conscious decision there, and it's all about how you want to break up the material, segment into different movements, and have an effect on the listener that way. And I thought it was very interesting going into this album, going into Reflektor, thinking that, you know, why did they choose to have this split up into two sections? And I think that it was a smart move personally, just because it makes sense with some of the content, some of the subject matter. Because there are some different themes, being set up on the front half that then they address on the back half again, especially with like the sequel track, Here Comes the Nighttime 2, which
kicks off
part 2. So there's a definite break there in the content, and so I think it kind of makes sense from that perspective, but that's just something that you kind of have to think about.
And one thing that you notice right away when you put on Reflektor, obviously you're listening to the single first, which if you're an Arcade Fire fan, you've probably heard it, and enjoying it again. They got a lot of praise, and it really sparked a lot of attention on the album. I always think it's interesting when a band releases a single, gets a lot of attention for the single, and then that single is the first track on an album. It's a very gutsy call when you're thinking about album construction. But you know, with thinking about where this band has come from, it kind of makes sense. You know, this is how they're bringing people. You know, bringing the old fans in with the new fans, giving the first track the most familiar track, putting it right up front, and then allowing the album to evolve and open up and kind of flower after that. The first thing I noticed was the long track lengths. You know, the single is 7.5 minutes long. The rest of the album, I'd say you know, without the second half of the last track, Supersymmetry is an 11 plus something track. But really it's only about a 5-6 minute track.
And it's got that ending kind of closing out
has
the
a nice
album.
Big ending to it. But the average track length on this album is 5.5 minutes or so. And that naturally says something to you about where Arcade Fire has taken their sound. These songs are more aggressive. They are they're trying to accomplish something that they're not going for that pop motif that you heard in previous albums.
And let's make let's draw a comparison here. This album is co-produced by James Murphy of LCD Sound System. LCD Sound System, if you ever listen to them, talk about drawn-out track lengths that have some repetition and groove over time. That's definitely what you hear on this record.
Right. Now, Arcade Fire actually set out to make Reflektor a shorter record, but then somewhere along the process, they ended up with 13 long tracks. So, you know, they definitely didn't make the record that they set out to be. And when you listen to this album, it has this almost just kind of mad scientist feel to it. There's a lot of sounds that you haven't heard Arcade Fire make before. They're experimenting with their own sound and trying to push themselves forward and to see what they can do with their sound, to tackle new subject matters, to tackle new genres even, which we'll get into in a second. But really, I think that that mad scientist kind of, this was made in a lab approach. It kind of comes off in how you listen to the album listening experience.
And you talked a little bit about genres. Let's tackle that, because this is a clearly different sound than we've heard the Arcade Fire do. The big thing is about them, you know, kind of going to Haiti and incorporating these more world beats into their sound, which, let's just come out and say, while that is new for the Arcade Fire, it's not really, I wouldn't say it's cliche, but it's not a new thing to do for bands that have kind of reached a peak and want to go somewhere else.
No, Talking Heads did it.
Talking Heads, exactly. And they had come out with 3 really damn good albums right before that. Similar thing, The Clash with Sandinista. If you listen to that album, after they had put out a slew of great albums, they came out with Sandinista that incorporated a lot of dub, similarly to how Arcade Fire does that here. I mean, hell, even the Beatles went over to India, started picking up sitar and some of those things, and while they didn't quite go as off the deep end with, you know, those sounds, maybe as I would say like Talking Heads did with Remain in Light, it certainly affected their sound. Now from there though, there are varying degrees of how to incorporate that. As I said, I think Talking Heads kind of went off the deep end with it because they not only incorporated those elements, but they completely changed the way they wrote songs. Their songwriting approach was nothing like it was for like their Talking Heads 77 debut. Now this, I think, is somewhere kind of in between. They're incorporating those elements, but if you just break it down to the melodies, you know, whether it be guitar or vocals, or
electronic synth-based melodies,
a lot of those things are actually fairly similar in this album. It's not like they just said, okay, we're going to write songs completely differently now. It's more just they wanted more of a groove focus so that it could kind of build upon those extra instrumentals that they were bringing into it.
And I think track 3 and 4, Flashbulb Eyes and Here Comes the Nighttime Part 1, or one of the 2, I exemplify this the most. Flashbulb Eyes has this almost like pseudo reggae beat to it. And it's the shortest song on the album, not even 3 minutes long, but it definitely is the most contorted sound I think that you hear. It's different than anything else on the album or anything else that you heard Arcade Fire do up to this point. Here Comes the Nighttime though it takes that same, it has kind of that Jamaican vibe. They recorded a good portion of this album in Jamaica, in a mansion in Jamaica. And, you know, it has that vibe, and when you get to the chorus and the melody in the chorus, like, you can hear those influences play in here. Now, the band also does, they don't abandon some of the sounds, the changes in sound that you heard on the Suburbs, you know, going back towards a more almost like punk rock driven edge to their sound. There's certain tracks, like on Normal Person, you hear a lot of, you know, kind of distorted guitar, the vocals are in the red, you know, it's very distorted. You already know, kind of plays like they're trying to do like a kind of jam punk band.
That has a very Suburbs vibe.
Yeah, it does. It sounds like a track off the Suburbs. Then on the back half, or disc 2, they get into more emotional tracks. Still a lot of electronic or disco influence on these tracks, which, and when I say disco, it's not the blatant disco you heard from back in the 70s, but it's more like indie disco, alternative rock.
It's mostly about the pulse of the bass and the way it lines up with the beat.
Yeah, and using electronic synth-based melodies.
Very much so. Still, though, I would say that the guitar and the vocals on those tracks are pretty typical Arcade Fire.
Absolutely.
And that's about, you know, kind of how those two mesh.
Yeah, it's just that they changed the sonic palette a little bit. So with this change in sound, this is a long album, deals with different genres, and even the album as a whole. The whole experience is a new pioneer, new frontier, for pioneers to a new frontier for the Arcade Fire. And the thing about it is, fans who have followed Arcade Fire up into this point are they've been dealt a very polarizing hand.
Yes.
There's really two distinct ways we've been hearing feedback on this album, and what we're hearing is that people either love this album.
I think this is not only the best Arcade Fire album, it's one of the best albums ever!
Or hate this album. I think these guys are total sellouts. They're pushing so hard to write something so big, and all they did is fall flat on their faces. When dealing with extremes like this, and extreme opinions or polarizing sounds like we hear on Reflektor, I think it's really important to look at the big picture when it comes to listening and reviewing music. So what Tom and I like to do on Velocities in Music and our listening experience is, first of all, we review and analyze the album. We don't listen to certain tracks. We don't listen to think about like where the band was in their previous works. It's really just taking the individual album. And now obviously there's a lot of factors that play into that, like the band's past or outside influences and things like that. But it's all about the album listening experience. From there, what we do is we take down all the categories that make up the sound and the listening experience. Things like songwriting, or the genres that they use, the style that they use, production, lyrics, vocals, all of these things, originality even. I mean, we break down all these different categories and then just do an assessment. How original is this? How good are the lyrics? How well did the vocalist perform? You know, to the vocal melodies of a you know, girth that we actually feel like it contributed to the album, or did it take away from the listening experience? We weigh all these factors and then make an overall assessment of the album as it compares to other music that's out right now. Now, with these extremes that we're dealing with, we'll take we'll pick a few that we feel like the polarizing effect is the greatest on, and we want to examine these for you now. Reflektor jumps all over the place when it comes to style, specifically genres. This thing is in reggae, there's a lot of electronica on here. It goes into some like quasi-punk rock thing that they're doing in part of the album. It's all over the place. It sounds messy. It doesn't sound cohesive. I'm listening to this. The tracks are super long, and it's really hard to get through because it's just the same style and idea over and over and over again. Unfortunately, the instrumentation doesn't do that much for me because I can't really hear any good melody lines. The melodies just aren't that great, and the performances, where's my guitar? I don't hear any guitar on this album. Unfortunately, there's just not enough here for me to get into. I just can't get an emotional vibe off the album because the performance and styles don't cut it.
The reason the style and instrumentation on Reflektor works is because they're taking things in a different direction, but they're not letting it undo all the things that made Arcade Fire great to begin with. yeah, there's a little bit less guitar. But really, when it comes down to it, Arcade Fire was never about the guitar. They're not a metal band. They're not a guitar band. They've had some cool guitar lines in the past, but really what this does is it just exemplifies the vocals, which has really been the focus of Arcade Fire to begin with. So all they're doing is they're subtly slipping in these kind of reggae and dub elements, mostly in the drums and percussion, but they're still letting the songwriting, and especially the vocal melodies, remain what has made Arcade Fire a staple in the music scene for so many years already.
So in addition to the aspects of the style and instrumentation that just rub me the wrong way, it doesn't evoke any passion in me. It just makes me really bored. To top off that, you have some real interesting problems in the lengths of the tracks and the structure of the tracks. These track lengths are so long, and it's not like I didn't expect that, knowing that James Murphy of LCD Sound System was writing and helping produce these tracks, or helping writing these tracks. These are long tracks. LCD Sound System had long tracks, but at least the melodies were good. At least the beat was good. At least it was dancey, something enjoyable. This, I have these melodies that don't, if there are melodies at all, they're not that inspiring. They just don't cut it for me. And the tracks just go on and on and on. The structure of these songs comes from a verse and a chorus, and a verse and a chorus. You may occasionally have some sort of a bridge in there, but it gets to be pretty predictable and stale. Plus, when you have super long track lengths, 13 tracks that all kind of have a similar structure, I'm really bored by the end of it.
Everybody's harping about how long the songs are. Oh my god, they're not that long, and if anything, they're actually justified. Let's take a look at this. The first track is 7.5 minutes. Yeah, that's a pretty long track. It's also the second to longest track on the album, and it goes in a lot of different places. The closing track, Supersymmetry, is like 11 minutes, but the whole last half of that might as well be a different song. If we're gonna harp on track lengths, you have to do it because of repetition. It's only really too long if you've got a lot of fluff that's just doing the same thing that's already been established. But these songs develop. When you take out the first and last tracks, which are the two longest tracks, the tracks average at maybe around 6 minutes. Yeah, it's a little longer than like a pop radio single, but only by a minute or two. And that extra minute or two is justified because the songs are actually developing and going different places. And when you put all of those together, you have an album that actually flows. Without any one of these pieces, it would not work as well. You look at the front half of the album. The songs flow into each other. Yeah, there's a break for the second half, being that it's a double album, but that's justified because that's why they made it a double album. They put that break there intentionally, and then the second half flows really well. So you have those two separate ideas that still come together cohesively, and while it is a little bit long of an album, it's good that it is because every segment of it is good and necessary for the entire album flow.
The production on this album is a complete joke. James Murphy, what were you doing? What were you thinking? This sound on here, there's just all sorts of, like, Win Butler's vocals are just draped in reverb. I can't hear him sing. I can't hear his pitch. He sounds awful. The guitars sound just flabby and gross, and I can barely hear them in the mix. The mix is all screwed up. There's nothing about this that sounds balanced. Occasionally, I'll hear a melody that is just buried in the mix, and I can't hear it. I can't hear it. And so the net effect is when I'm listening to this, I just don't hear anything besides absolute slop.
What do you want this to be, Lady Gaga's new record? It's not going to be club dance music. They're incorporating dance elements, but really the reason it works is because they're trying to get a raw human element into it. You know, think about the bands that we talked about earlier who've incorporated this kind of world music into their sound before. You got the Beatles, you got the Clash. These bands were doing this with the reggae and dub styles back in the 60s and 70s because that's when those genres were starting to hit an actual pop market. If they had produced this to be all bass and all high-end like a modern dance record, then it wouldn't have accurately incorporated those styles to begin with, because that's not a part of those styles. You can't bring congas and those kind of like African or Jamaican drums into it if you're going to produce them just to be like any pop record. You have to make the sound fit, and it brings that raw humanity into the sound through the production that they went for in the instrumentation.
In the past, Win Butler has been a god when it comes to writing great lyrics. Lyrics that just evoke tons of emotion and excitement and make you think about the music, that bring your mind into the music and make you think about how Arcade Fire is writing their songs and getting just more of an experience out of the entire sound that you're hearing. Now, on Reflektor, the lyrics just aren't up to par. You have some really, really cheesy lines on this album, like, "Tell me why they treat me like this, because we do it like this. We scream and shout till we work it out, but you're still confused, but I'm the one with the heavy heart, 'cause I follow you." Come on, Win Butler, you can do so much better. On every other album you've done, so much better. Why'd you have to drop the ball with Reflektor?
The lyrics on this album are actually really good, and they are definitely different. They're approached differently than past Arcade Fire albums, but they really help to tie the whole record together, and the way they do that is with various themes. Yeah, maybe they're not going for the specific, direct, individual's emotional appeal like they have in the past, but one theme you come across a lot of different times is themes of like heaven and dying. There's a whole track called Afterlife. You have some kind of religious allusions, which is something they did a lot on Neon Bible, with the line, "If you want to be righteous, get in line," or how about, "I know you're living in my mind, it's not the same as being alive." Like, wow, that's hugely evocative. And also the way they tie that together into like technology. I mean, the album's called Reflektor. Think about like, the opening track, all of the kind of technological references in there. You go to like flashbulb eyes with lines like, does the camera really take your soul? Musings like that, which then you compare that to the more native percussion in there. It really ties everything together. Still, you have commentary on society in tracks like Normal Person and Porno, talking about just the psychology of human beings in general. You also have the Greek allusions to characters like Orpheus and Eurydice, and it just ties in this whole other culture, and it really brings everything together in a way that you can analyze intellectually and emotionally.
The vocals on Reflektor are something that beg the question, were these guys even trying? Win Butler sings predominantly on all these songs. Now, aside from having David Bowie on the title track, Reflektor, the first track, the vocals really just go downhill after that. Win Butler doesn't really have a lot of good vocal parts, and while vocal melodies are part of the songwriting, he really didn't pay much attention to how he was singing. A lot of his vocal tracks sound really weak. He doesn't project very well. I think part of it's because of the production just being layered and reverb. You can't hear any tone. You can't hear any of his passion. And when you do, he sounds like a drama student who's just drank way too much coffee. Sadly, we don't hear very many Regine vocals on this album, whereas in previous efforts you actually had tracks that featured Regine on vocals. Here she mainly just does backing parts, and maybe an occasional choral vocal, but really the big choral vocals you heard on tracks like Wake Up from Funeral, that pack such an emotional punch that just lit your soul up, those are nowhere to be found on Reflektor. The vocals really suffered on this album and are a big reason why Reflektor is just a big fail.
The vocals certainly don't do the same things that they did on previous Arcade Fire records, but that's because they're going in a completely different direction. Here we have a focus on the instrumentals, and we have the vocals there to back up the instrumental palette rather than the other way around, which is the way it's been on previous Arcade Fire albums. I think that this is fine. I think it's actually another point in favor of Reflektor because it shows that they're able to go into a different direction and actually embrace it rather than trying to do all of the same things that they were doing in the past. So maybe there isn't as many melodies that are highlights, that are the focus, but they still accomplish what they need to accomplish, and more than anything, they don't steal the limelight away from all the other good things that are going on in the instrumentals.
whenever Tom and I hear these extreme perspectives on an album, from passionate fans, fans that have been with a band for so long, or new fans that are just really in love with the sound, we always have a vein of skepticism, I'd say, when we approach our listen. Because Tom and I, we've been doing this for a while. We really are able, I think, to break down the album into different sections and then really listen to the different attributes of the album. Now, I never ever try to buy, whenever we hear an album that's hyped one way or another, I always try, I know you do this too, I always try to make sure that I go, is the hype justified or is it not? When you get an album polarized, like Reflektor is, where there's one faction that loves the album and one faction that, really dislikes the album, I tend to see a little bit of both. Yeah. Tom, what was your experience with Reflektor?
Well, from the beginning, I liked this album. Yeah, it was different. Honestly, when I heard the single for the first time, I actually didn't like it that much. Really? But that's the way it's been with me and Arcade Fire in the past anyways. When I heard Month of May off of Suburbs, I didn't like it at all. But it's because Arcade Fire makes album experiences. You can't really just listen to tracks out of the context of the whole album, because that's not what they're designed to do, which is why I kind of hate the idea of pre-release singles anyways. I actually try to avoid them a lot of the time. We'll have fans say, hey, did you hear the new track by this band? I'm like, don't want to, just want to hear the album when it comes out. Right. But this is one that I couldn't help myself, but I should have known better. Yeah. Still though, once I listened through the entire album, I actually really liked it. I thought that, the sound was different, and it took me a little bit of getting used to, but I could tell that there was a lot of good songwriting there. Right. And really from there, what happened for me is the tracks that I liked at first, I ended up liking more and more on each listen. I probably listened to this thing around 8 times total, and still, they just kept liking them more and more. But there were a few tracks that I thought were a little bit lacking, and I ended up just completely flatlining on those. They never really grew on me. But I know your experience was very different.
Yeah, so this started off for me, I was listening to this in my car driving down to Des Moines to do some shopping with my wife. And, we were listening to Reflektor, and she's a big Arcade Fire fan too, so it was kind of a joint experience, something we can do together and things like that. And let me say, like, in my car, my speakers in my car probably did not do this album justice. Because what I heard is I only heard just Win Butler's vocals and a lot of the reverb around there, which, is kind of polarizing in and of itself. But there's not a lot of really stark melodies like on previous records. So what I heard was kind of these clumsy, fat songs that just went on forever and ever, and it really did not leave a good taste in my mouth. And the problem with that is that the next couple listens I was spent while I was working on my house, just kind of on small speakers, just playing the album, which works sometimes for a lot of albums. Yeah. Not this album. Not this album. And I was really puzzled, because here I have this guy, a guy that I trust in music, really, just a person that has inspired me to get into a lot of music that I found challenging over the years, saying that he really likes it. So I know that I'm missing something, right?
You were real frustrated.
I was frustrated. Well, and the reason why I get frustrated is because if I don't know why I don't like something, I need to figure out why. And I couldn't put my finger on it. And whether it was my expectations as an Arcade Fire fan, whether it was just the sour taste that they left in my mouth, I actually think that I came to a good conclusion. And I actually like this album a lot better the first time I listened to it with headphones turned up loud. I went and I like Arcade Fire on Facebook, and I noticed that when the day Reflektor was released, they posted about it on their Facebook wall, and they said, don't forget to turn it up loud. Why would you need to turn it out? If an album is good, yes, it enhances the listening experience, but turning it up loud. But I shouldn't feel like I have to turn it up really loud to actually understand the album.
And what that denotes is poor production, mixing, and mastering.
And that is the #1 problem with Reflektor.
Absolutely is, because there is a lot of good songwriting driving this album.
There's a lot of great melodies, a lot of great guitar lines that you don't even hear because the guitar is mixed so low. Case in point, Normal Person.
Normal Person. That is the prime example, because listening to that song, it goes into the chorus, and the chorus is supposed to be booming. And see, it's funny because I primarily listened to this album on headphones. I only listened to it on open speakers maybe like twice. Right. My first like 5 or 6 listens were on headphones.
Totally different experience.
Which makes sense as to why I liked it a lot more than you at first. Because when you listen to the chorus of Normal Person, when it gets intense, the only way it gets intense is because the bass is turned up, you have that lead guitar line come in, and you have the cymbals that are crashing a little bit heavier. There is still no rhythm guitar, and because of that, the mid-range of the frequency spectrum is just not represented, and that's where you get that beefy crunch. Just listen to that song and imagine in that chorus a nice just heavy, distorted guitar riffs. It would have sounded huge.
Yeah, more contrast.
On open speakers, that's one spot that I actually felt sounded a little better because the bass is able to boom. It's hard to get, even with nice headphones, it's hard to get booming bass. Yeah. So the contrast is just a little more there. But the whole point of mixing, production, and mastering is to make it so that the album sounds good on any system, because production is supposed to complement the songwriting. If the production doesn't bring out the good elements of the songwriting in any situation, if you have to listen to it under certain circumstances for it to be enjoyable, then you have not done a good job of those things.
And that first listen in my car, you know, thinking that these songs were long and fat and clumsy, that whole disposition was just washed away once I listened to this on headphones with the volume turned up. Songs like Here Comes the Nighttime, Normal Person, You Already Know, and Awful Sound, I really latched onto, whereas I didn't like them at first. I really grew to like them because those are the songs, you know, they average probably, you know, 5 to 6 minutes in length, and, you know, there's a lot of stuff going on there. You just can't hear it unless it's turned up well, and you can really listen to the little idiosyncrasies going on in the mix. If you can't hear those, you can't understand what's actually going on in that sound.
And, you know, I mentioned kind of tongue-in-cheek when we were doing our back and forth there, you know, what do you want this to be the new Lady Gaga record? And I think that would be an unfair expectation. Absolutely. But at the same time, it doesn't mean you have to go all the way up to that mark, but there's still room for a happy medium. It could have been a lot better, still without sounding modern and poppy. I just think the production could have been done better. Another thing I want to address is the lengths. You know, we spoke about kind of the extreme ways of viewing that, and once again, I feel like it's somewhere in the middle. The one big thing I'll say is that if you wanted to improve this album by shortening it, I wouldn't say shorten individual songs. I would say just remove some of the weaker songs and keep the songs in there at the same length.
Let's just agree. Can we cut Joan of Arc?
We can cut Joan of Arc.
Oh, man.
I would even say cut You Already Know, personally. I know that you like that track a little bit better than me. I think it's a decent track individually, but I don't think the sound fits with the album.
I actually agree with you. It sounds straight off of the Suburbs, and this album is not the Suburbs.
This album is a slow, grooving, it's got kind of a dark, upbeat feel, whereas that is just kind of bright and up-tempo and a little bit poppier in the writing, and I just, especially coming off of Normal Person, which is just one of the most facetious, just biting songs on the album, I didn't think it fit at all. From there, I think that the back half is a little more consistent.
Yeah, the back half of this album is actually really good. Here Comes the Nighttime, in context of being the first song on the second half of the album, I can live with, but in context of a straight-through listen, really bogged down that part of the album for me. But then Awful Sound, It's Never Over, which is my favorite track on the record, Porno, and Afterlife are all gems,
really
in my opinion.
Yep.
You know, Awful Sound is some very, very clever songwriting in that song, and if you're not paying attention, you'll miss it. But when they start talking in the lyrics about an awful sound, you hear an ear-piercing awful sound, and it just the effect, that contrast, just knocks me off my feet every time I listen to that. It's Never Over. You actually get some of the shouting choruses, and when they go, "Hey, Orpheus," like, that's really cool. That's what I want to hear from the Arcade Fire. And while that's not present throughout the entire album, it's nice that on one track they at least knock me off my feet with that. Porno and Afterlife, both, you know, I'd say into new territory for Arcade Fire, and they do a great job with those songs experimenting with different types of melody.
I know that one song you really didn't like was Flashbulb Eyes.
Yeah.
I actually liked that song pretty well. I think that jumps back to kind of the more of the Clash Sandinista type style. Personally, I feel like they pull it off. I'm glad that it's not one of the 6-minute tracks, but I'd also like to point out, you know, your two least favorite songs are the two shortest songs.
Right.
They're the only ones that are under 3 minutes, and so I think that was done deliberately, and I think that was good planning on their part, if they're going to include those at all. I would still rather remove Joan of Arc and You Already Know, personally, but then it messes with the flow a little bit, because then it wouldn't really be justified as a double album, and I'm not sure if that flow would have worked the same.
Yeah,
so
I think most of my problems with Flashbulb Eyes are to do with the production. There's so much reverb and delay in that song that it just kind of makes it sound really messy. I'm into clean, specific sounding songs. I really want every single sound that I hear to be extremely specific and not just something that the production was a byproduct of a production effect. And I really get that, like, there's times on this album where that does occur, where I do have that feeling that really these sounds that I'm hearing aren't the byproduct of Win and regimes or the songwriters, just this grand scheme that they have. It's more just, you know, they were messing around in the studio, oh, it sounds alright, let's just keep it. You know, it doesn't have that sense of divine providence that Funeral or even the Suburbs had at times. You know, in terms of Arcade Fire's discography, I'd say that this is probably my least favorite. I'd put this on par with somewhere like Neon Bible, which I thought was pretty hit or miss track by track. There are a lot, the vast majority of tracks on Reflektor I like. There's a handful that I don't, but it does make the listen to be a bit disjointed. And from a straight through album listening perspective, Tom's right. They would have been better to just cut a track or two and make this a bit more palatable. Overall, this is a solid record, but I don't think that this is anything. This is not, in my opinion, the best Arcade Fire record. And how it measures up, this is a good record for most of the music that's coming out this year. But, you know, I'm still interested to see what they're going to do in the future. Yeah, I agree. I really like this album. Like I said, I liked it from the beginning. I liked it more and more as I listened to it. But as the parts I liked continued to grow on me, and I liked more and more, the things that I didn't like just became a little bit more agitating and noticeable. But still, I mean, there are a lot of songs here that I really liked, and every time I listened to it, I still enjoyed it straight through. I think it's a strong effort, and I think a unique statement in the music scene today, where I think that most people's musical statements are getting a little. You got to give them credit for really trying and really having an idea and going for it. And some people won't like the genres that they're incorporating in here, and I think that makes sense. I think that's fine. It's a trade-off with originality. Yeah, it's not an inherently good or bad thing to do that. It's about how you pull it off, and I think at some points they really succeed, and I think at some points it does sound a little bit forced. But as an album, when you put all of those elements together, I think it sounds pretty consistent in style, in mood, which I really liked. I think it's a more consistent listening experience than Neon Bible was, despite the weaker tracks. Right. What do you think you're going to give this album? I'm going to give this an 83. I really did like it. Still slightly lower than you, although I've come way up on it. I'm going to go 78 on this record. All right. That puts this at an 81 from us. This is a must-listen record. Even if we would have given this in the 60s, I think it deserves to be a must-listen, just because it's so thought-provoking. Obviously, this is one of the longest reviews we've done in several years. It's true. So we hope that you guys, you know, first of all, thank you for taking the time to watch this. If you guys have feedbacks on your experiences with Reflektor, what you would like it to be, or that it's not, or what you love about it that you didn't expect, we'd love to hear your feedback at www.velocitiesofmusic.com or youtube.com/velocitiesofmusic. As always, follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and let us know what albums that you'd like to see us review on this channel from all time. I'm Jake. I'm Tom. And we are VIMTV, moving music critique forward.